Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Revelation. Eric Maloney had always prided himself on being observant. 23 years as a private investigator had honed his instincts to razor-sharp precision. But somehow, he'd missed the most important clues in his own home. The evening started like any other Wednesday. His sister Rosemary was in labor at St. Mary's Hospital, and Eric had volunteered to watch his 7-year-old niece, Charlotte, while the family gathered for the birth. His wife, Melissa Maloney, had claimed she was working late again at her marketing firm, the third time this week. Charlotte sat at their oak dining table, poking at the spaghetti Eric had prepared. She was typically a voracious eater, but tonight she seemed different, distracted. When she finally took a bite, she immediately spit it out, her small face contorting in distress. "Are you okay?" Eric asked worriedly, rushing to her side. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Uncle Eric," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I feel really sick." Within minutes, Eric was speeding toward the hospital, Charlotte curled up in the passenger seat. Dr. Wayne Perry, a family friend who'd treated Charlotte since birth, ran a series of tests while Eric paced the waiting room, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When Dr. Perry emerged with the results, his expression was grave. "Eric, I need to ask you something important. Has Charlotte been around anyone who might have given her something unusual to eat or drink recently?" "What do you mean?" Eric's investigative instincts kicked in. "The reason she can't keep food down is because she's been systematically poisoned. Small doses of ipecac syrup over the past few weeks. It's designed to induce vomiting. Someone's been deliberately making her sick." Eric's blood ran cold. Charlotte had been staying with him every Tuesday and Wednesday while Rosemary worked double shifts at the diner. The only people who had access to her during those times were Eric and Melissa. "Doctor, are you absolutely certain?" "The blood work doesn't lie. Someone close to Charlotte has been poisoning her, probably to make her appear chronically ill. I've seen this before in custody battles or insurance fraud cases." As Eric processed this information, his phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "Baby boy born healthy. Charlotte can meet her brother tomorrow." But Eric's mind was elsewhere. If someone was poisoning Charlotte, and it wasn't him, then there was only one other possibility. But why would Melissa hurt an innocent child? The answer came to him like a physical blow. Melissa had recently increased Charlotte's life insurance policy, claiming it was for family protection. She'd also been asking pointed questions about Rosemary's financial situation and whether Eric was planning to help support Charlotte's education. Eric's hands clenched into fists. He'd spent his career uncovering lies and deception, but he'd been blind to the viper in his own nest. If Melissa was capable of poisoning a child, what else was she hiding? Over the next hour, as Charlotte stabilized and the ipecac worked its way out of her system, Eric made a series of calculated phone calls. His contact at the surveillance equipment company owed him a favor. His old partner from the PI firm could set up discreet monitoring, and his lawyer, Dominic Robbins, would need to be briefed on a potential criminal case. Eric Maloney wasn't just angry. He was coldly, methodically furious. And when Eric Maloney decided someone needed to pay for their crimes, he never stopped until the debt was collected in full. As he sat beside Charlotte's hospital bed, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks, Eric began planning. He would uncover every secret Melissa had hidden, every lie she'd told, and every crime she'd committed. And when he was done, she would understand that some betrayals carried a price that could never be fully paid. The game was about to begin, and Eric intended to win. Chapter 2. The Investigation. 3 weeks had passed since Charlotte's hospitalization. To the outside world, Eric Maloney appeared to be the same devoted husband, still bringing Melissa her morning coffee, still kissing her goodbye before work. But beneath the surface, he was conducting the most important investigation of his career. The surveillance equipment was in place. Micro cameras hidden in air vents, audio devices disguised as phone chargers, GPS trackers on both of Melissa's vehicles. Eric had transformed their home into an observation laboratory, and Melissa was his unwitting subject. What he discovered in those first few weeks shattered any remaining illusion of the life he thought he'd been living. Melissa wasn't working late. She was spending her evenings at the Riverside Motel with Shane Stevenson, Eric's former business partner and closest friend for over 15 years. The man who'd been best man at their wedding, who'd eaten dinner at their table countless times, who'd held Eric's hand at his father's funeral. The betrayal cut deeper than Eric had expected, but he forced himself to remain clinical. Emotion was the enemy of effective revenge. Through painstaking surveillance, Eric learned that Melissa and Shane's affair had been going on for nearly 2 years. They'd been planning to leave their respective spouses and start a new life together in Costa Rica, where Shane had been secretly transferring money to offshore accounts. But the most damning discovery came when Eric hacked into Melissa's laptop. Hidden in encrypted files, he found detailed plans for Charlotte's murder. Melissa had been systematically poisoning the child, not for insurance money, but to create a pattern of illness that would culminate in what appeared to be a tragic death from a rare condition. The motive was chillingly simple. Rosemary's will named Eric as Charlotte's guardian and the trustee of a substantial inheritance from their grandmother. If Charlotte died, Eric would inherit everything, and as his wife, Melissa would have access to those funds for her new life with Shane. Eric's hands shook as he read Melissa's detailed notes about increasing the ipecac doses, her research into untraceable poisons, and her cold calculations about the timing of Charlotte's death. She'd planned it all with the precision of a surgeon and the compassion of a serial killer. That night, as Melissa slept beside him, Eric lay awake staring at the ceiling. 23 years ago, he'd fallen in love with a young marketing assistant who seemed kind and ambitious. Somewhere along the way, she'd become a monster willing to murder a child for money. The next morning, Eric made his move. He called his old friend Jorge Ackerman, who ran a private security firm specializing in corporate espionage. Jorge owed Eric several favors, and his team had resources that even Eric's PI background couldn't match. "I need complete background checks on 2 individuals," Eric told Jorge over a secure phone line. "Everything, finances, communications, travel records, associates. And I need it done without leaving any digital footprints." Within 48 hours, Jorge's team had uncovered the full scope of Shane and Melissa's operation. Shane had been embezzling from his current business partners, using the stolen money to fund the Costa Rica plan. Melissa had been slowly liquidating their joint assets, transferring the money to accounts she thought Eric couldn't access. More importantly, Jorge's team discovered that Charlotte wasn't Melissa's first victim. 7 years ago, when Melissa had briefly worked as a home health aide, an elderly client had died unexpectedly after showing symptoms consistent with slow poisoning. The case had been ruled natural causes, but the pattern was unmistakable. Eric now had enough evidence to destroy both Melissa and Shane through legal channels. He could have them arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned. But that wasn't enough. Prison was temporary, and Eric Maloney believed in permanent solutions to permanent problems. As he reviewed the mountain of evidence spread across his home office, Eric began to smile for the first time in weeks. Melissa and Shane thought they were the hunters in this scenario, but they were about to learn they'd been the prey all along. The real fun was about to begin. Chapter 3: The Setup. Eric Maloney understood that the best traps were the ones the prey walked into willingly. Over the next month, he began laying the groundwork for what would become the most elaborate revenge scheme of his career. First, he needed to ensure Charlotte's safety. Using his connections in law enforcement, Eric arranged for Charlotte to spend the next few months with their Aunt Clara Chavez in Denver, ostensibly to help her recover from her mysterious illness. Melissa seemed relieved by the arrangement, which only confirmed Eric's suspicions about her murderous intentions. With Charlotte safely away, Eric could focus on the psychological warfare he'd planned for his wife and former friend. He started subtly, small changes that would make them paranoid without revealing his hand. Shane's business began experiencing mysterious setbacks, key clients canceling contracts after receiving anonymous tips about financial irregularities, suppliers demanding payment up front after hearing rumors about cash flow problems. Nothing Eric couldn't plausibly deny, but enough to make Shane sweat. For Melissa, Eric's approach was more personal. He began leaving subtle hints that he might be growing suspicious. He'd casually mentioned seeing her car in parts of town where she claimed she'd never been. He'd ask innocent questions about her work schedule that didn't quite add up. He made sure she knew he was watching, without ever directly confronting her. The psychological pressure began to show. Melissa became jumpy, constantly checking her phone, looking over her shoulder. Shane started drinking more heavily, making mistakes that Eric's contacts in the business community were happy to exploit. Meanwhile, Eric was building his masterpiece. Through Jorge's connections, he'd identified a small island property off the coast of Belize that was perfect for his needs. Officially, it was a legitimate real estate investment. Unofficially, it would serve as the stage for the final act of his revenge. Eric created a fictional business opportunity, a lucrative consulting contract in Central America that would require both Shane and Melissa's expertise. He used a shell company, fake references, and forged documents to make the opportunity appear irresistible. The job would pay enough to fund their Costa Rica dreams, and it would require them to travel to Belize for an initial site survey. The beauty of the trap was that it appealed to their greed and their paranoia simultaneously. They wanted the money, but they also wanted to get away from Eric's increasingly suspicious behavior. To sell the deception, Eric enlisted help from Salvatore Davison, a former colleague who now worked in international business consulting. Salvatore contacted Shane directly, presenting the opportunity as a referral from a mutual acquaintance who'd heard about Shane's financial expertise. Eric watched from his surveillance setup as Shane excitedly told Melissa about the unexpected windfall. They were so focused on their escape plan that they never questioned why such a perfect opportunity had fallen into their laps at exactly the right moment. Within 2 weeks, Shane and Melissa had accepted the contract and booked flights to Belize. They planned to make the trip together, telling their respective spouses that they were attending separate business conferences in different cities. Eric had them exactly where he wanted them. The night before their departure, Eric made his final preparations. He transferred specific equipment to the Belize property, arranged for certain services to be available on the island, and confirmed that his own travel plans would put him in position at the right time. As Melissa packed for what she thought was a business trip, Eric kissed her goodbye and wished her luck with her conference. She smiled and promised to call every day, the same lies falling from her lips as easily as breathing. After she left for the airport, Eric stood in their bedroom, looking at the space they'd shared for 8 years. By the time Melissa and Shane returned from Belize, if they returned, everything would be different. Eric Maloney had never been a man who forgave betrayal, and he was about to remind the world why. Chapter 4. The Island. The private island Eric had purchased through a shell company was beautiful in the way that isolated places often are. Pristine beaches, crystal clear water, and not another soul for miles in any direction. Shane and Melissa arrived on the small charter plane Eric had arranged, believing they were meeting with potential clients to discuss a major infrastructure project. The property came with a modest resort facility, a main house, several guest cabins, and all the amenities needed for a comfortable stay. What Shane and Melissa didn't know was that Eric had arrived 2 days earlier, using a different charter service and carrying identification under one of his old aliases. From his hidden position in the main house's security room, Eric watched as his wife and former friend settled into their accommodations. They were giddy with excitement, celebrating what they believed was the first step toward their new life together. "This is perfect," Melissa said as she unpacked in a master cabin. "Once we close this deal, we'll have enough to disappear forever." Shane wrapped his arms around her from behind. "And Eric will never find us. By the time he realizes what happened, we'll be long gone." Eric's smile was cold as he recorded every word. They had no idea they were already found. The first night proceeded exactly as Eric had planned. The supposed clients, actors Eric had hired through Jorge's network, arrived by boat and conducted a believable business dinner. They discussed the fictional project, reviewed fake contracts, and promised to have final papers ready within 48 hours. After the clients departed, promising to return the next evening, Shane and Melissa were alone on the island with only the resort's minimal staff, all of whom were actually Eric's employees. The second day began innocuously enough. Shane and Melissa spent the morning on the beach, swimming and planning their future. But as evening approached, Eric began implementing the psychological phase of his plan. It started with small things. The internet connection mysteriously failed. Cell phone service became spotty. The staff mentioned unusual weather patterns that might delay the client's return. Shane and Melissa found themselves increasingly isolated, dependent on the island's communication systems that Eric controlled completely. That night, Eric made his first direct move. Using the resort's intercom system, he began playing recordings of their own conversations, intimate moments between Shane and Melissa that could only have been captured through extensive surveillance. The psychological impact was immediate. Melissa and Shane realized someone had been watching them, recording them, studying their every move. But they had no idea who or why. "Someone knows about us," Melissa whispered as they huddled together in their cabin. "Someone's been following us." Shane tried to rationalize it. "Maybe it's just someone trying to blackmail us. We'll pay them off and disappear like we planned." But Eric wasn't interested in money. He was interested in justice. On the third night, Eric revealed himself. He walked into their cabin as they slept, settling into a chair and waiting for them to wake. When Melissa's eyes opened and focused on him, her scream woke Shane instantly. "Hello, darling," Eric said calmly. "Did you sleep well?" Shane scrambled for his phone, but Eric held up a device that jammed all electronic signals. "I'm afraid we're quite alone out here. Just the three of us and some very important conversations we need to have." Melissa tried to maintain her innocence. "Eric, what are you doing here? How did you find you?" Eric interrupted. "Melissa, I'm a private investigator. Finding people is what I do for a living. The question isn't how I found you. The question is what I'm going to do now that I have." The next several hours were a masterclass in psychological interrogation. Eric had every piece of evidence, every recorded conversation, every financial transaction. He laid it all out methodically, watching as Shane and Melissa's denials crumbled into desperate bargaining. They offered money. They offered to leave the country permanently. They offered to confess to the authorities and accept prison time. Eric listened to it all with the patience of a man who held all the cards. "You poisoned a 7-year-old child," he finally said. "You planned to murder her for money. Prison isn't enough. Exile isn't enough. You crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." As dawn broke over the Caribbean, Eric explained exactly what was going to happen next. Shane and Melissa would spend the next several days on the island, while Eric implemented the final phase of his plan. They would have time to think about their choices, to understand the full scope of their situation. And they would learn that Eric Maloney's concept of justice was far more creative and far more permanent than anything the legal system could provide. Chapter 5. The Confession. For 3 days, Shane and Melissa remained confined to their cabin on the island, with Eric controlling every aspect of their environment. He provided them with basic necessities, but no communication with the outside world. No phones, no internet, no way to call for help. During this time, Eric began his psychological dismantling of their partnership. He learned from years of interrogation that isolated people under stress would eventually turn on each other, and he intended to accelerate that process. He started by playing recordings of their private conversations at random intervals throughout the day and night. Moments where Shane had expressed doubts about Melissa, times when Melissa had criticized Shane's business acumen, intimate conversations where each had revealed unflattering opinions about the other. The effect was devastating. After 24 hours of hearing their own words weaponized against them, Shane and Melissa were no longer clinging to each other for support. They were starting to see each other as liabilities. Eric capitalized on this division by providing each of them with separate opportunities to confess and potentially save themselves. He visited Shane alone, explaining that Melissa had already begun cooperating and that Shane's best option was to provide his own version of events. "She's trying to pin everything on you," Eric told Shane during one of these sessions. "The poisoning, the embezzlement, even the original plan to leave your spouses. According to her, you're the mastermind and she's just an innocent victim." Shane's protests were weak. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified. "That's not true. The poisoning was her idea. I never wanted to hurt Charlotte. Eric recorded every word. He used the same technique with Melissa, convincing her that Shane was attempting to take sole credit for their business schemes while painting her as a cold-blooded child murderer. He says you seduced him into the affair, Eric told his wife, that you manipulated him into embezzling money and that the plan to kill Charlotte was something you developed on your own. Melissa broke down completely. He's lying. We planned everything together. He was the one who suggested we needed Charlotte's inheritance to fund our new life. He researched the poisons. He helped me calculate the doses. Within 72 hours, Eric had comprehensive confessions from both parties, each blaming the other while admitting to crimes that would result in life sentences. But Eric wasn't planning to turn these confessions over to authorities. He had something far more permanent in mind. On the fourth night, Eric gathered Shane and Melissa in the main house for what he called their final discussion. They sat across from him at a large conference table, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow from days of psychological torture. I want you to understand something, Eric began. I've spent the last month studying every aspect of your lives. I know about Shane's gambling debts, Melissa's childhood trauma, your insecurities, your weaknesses, your deepest fears. I've mapped every relationship you have, every person you care about, every place you've ever felt safe. He paused, letting the implications sink in. You betrayed my trust, tried to murder my niece, and stole from our families. That kind of betrayal doesn't deserve a quick resolution. It deserves something memorable. Eric stood and walked to a wall-mounted monitor, which flickered to life, showing a map of the Caribbean with their current location marked. This island is officially uninhabited. The boat that brought you here has been reported as lost at sea due to mechanical failure. Your disappearance will be investigated, but the search will focus on the waters between here and Belize City, where your bodies will never be found because they're not there. Melissa began sobbing. Shane tried to stand, but Eric's voice stopped him. Sit down, Shane. I'm not finished. The monitor now showed a different view. Live footage from security cameras Eric had installed around the island's perimeter. You see, you're not actually trapped here by me. You're trapped here by geography and logistics. This island is 47 miles from the nearest populated area. The water is filled with bull sharks and tiger sharks. There are no boats, no planes, no communication equipment you can access. Eric's smile was genuinely friendly, which made his words even more chilling. I'm leaving tomorrow morning. After that, your survival will depend entirely on your own resourcefulness and how well you can work together. Given what I've learned about your relationship over the past few days, I'd say your prospects are limited. The true genius of Eric's revenge was becoming clear. He wasn't going to kill them directly. He was going to strand them in a place where their own character flaws and mutual betrayals would likely do the job for him. And if they somehow managed to survive and find their way back to civilization, Eric had already prepared for that contingency as well. Chapter 6. The Trap Titans. Eric left the island on the fifth morning, taking the chartered boat back to Belize City and then catching a commercial flight to Houston. To anyone tracking his movements, it would appear he'd been in Texas on business while his wife was attending her fictional conference in Miami. But his departure from the island didn't mean the end of his involvement. Hidden cameras throughout the property would continue streaming live footage to servers Eric controlled, giving him front-row seats to whatever unfolded between Shane and Melissa. What he witnessed over the next several days exceeded even his darkest expectations. Without Eric's presence to unite them against a common threat, Shane and Melissa's partnership disintegrated with shocking speed. The recordings Eric had played during their captivity had poisoned their relationship beyond repair, but now, facing potential death, their true natures emerged. Shane, it turned out, was a coward when stripped of his civilized veneer. Instead of working with Melissa to find a way off the island, he spent his time searching for supplies to hoard for himself. He broke into the resort's emergency storage, rationing food and water as if he were planning for a siege. Melissa, meanwhile, proved to be far more ruthless than Eric had even suspected. When she discovered Shane's hoarding, she didn't confront him directly. Instead, she began poisoning his private food stash with cleaning chemicals from the resort's maintenance closet. The same methodical approach she'd used on Charlotte. Eric watched from his Houston hotel room as the two people who betrayed him began destroying each other with a viciousness that made his own revenge seem almost merciful by comparison. On the seventh day, Shane discovered what Melissa had been doing to his food. The confrontation that followed was recorded in vivid detail by Eric's hidden cameras. "You psychotic bitch," Shane screamed, hurling the contaminated cans at Melissa. "You were trying to kill me. Like you weren't planning to leave me here to die." Melissa shot back. "I saw you building that raft in secret. You were going to take all the supplies and abandon me." Their fight escalated quickly from verbal to physical. Shane, weakened by days of consuming low-level toxins, was no match for Melissa's desperate fury. She struck him with a piece of driftwood, opening a gash on his forehead that bled profusely. But Shane's injury proved to be a turning point. As Melissa watched him bleeding, something shifted in her expression. The woman who'd been coldly planning to murder a child for money suddenly seemed horrified by the sight of blood she'd actually spilled. She began trying to help Shane, bandaging his wound and sharing her own food supplies. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might find a way to work together after all. Eric found their reconciliation almost disappointing. He'd hoped they would destroy each other completely, saving him the trouble of implementing the backup plans he'd prepared. But as he continued watching, he realized their reunion was built on desperation rather than genuine forgiveness, and it wouldn't last long. He was right. By the 10th day, as their situation became increasingly desperate, Shane and Melissa began discussing the unthinkable. One of them would have to die so the other could survive long enough to be rescued. "We could draw straws," Shane suggested with a matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing dinner plans. "Or we could decide based on who has the better chance of making it back to shore," Melissa countered. Eric marveled at how easily they'd moved from lovers to potential murderers. Perhaps they'd always been killers at heart, and he'd simply provided the circumstances for their true natures to emerge. On the 12th day, their debate was settled by forces beyond their control. A tropical storm hit the area, destroying most of the island's infrastructure and washing away the makeshift shelter they'd constructed. When the storm passed, only one of them was left alive. Eric watched the survivor frantically signaling to passing aircraft, not knowing that Eric had already arranged for their rescue. After all, he needed a witness to return home and spread the story of what had happened on the island. The survivor would tell authorities about the business trip that went wrong, the storm that claimed their partner's life, and their miraculous rescue after nearly 2 weeks alone. They would become a hero, a survivor, someone who'd endured unimaginable hardship and loss. And then Eric would implement the final phase of his revenge. Because the game wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. Chapter 7, The Return. Melissa Maloney was rescued from the island on the 14th day by a Coast Guard helicopter that had been routinely patrolling the area. She was dehydrated, sunburned, and traumatized, but alive. Shane's body was never recovered, officially swept away by the storm that had devastated the island. Eric received the call about his wife's rescue while he was still in Houston, having established a perfect alibi for the entire time period. He expressed appropriate shock and relief, immediately arranging for a private medical transport to bring Melissa back to their home city for treatment. When Eric saw Melissa in the hospital, her transformation was striking. The confident, manipulative woman who'd tried to murder a child had been replaced by a hollow-eyed survivor who flinched at sudden movements. 2 weeks of psychological warfare, followed by a fight for survival, had broken something fundamental inside her. "I'm so sorry," she whispered when Eric took her hand beside her hospital bed. "Shane and we were having an affair. I was going to leave you. I'm so sorry." Eric played his role perfectly. The devastated but forgiving husband, grateful to have his wife back alive despite her betrayal. He brought her flowers, held her during nightmares about the storm, and publicly supported her during the investigation into Shane's disappearance. But privately, Eric was implementing the most psychologically devastating phase of his revenge plan. The island experience had been designed to break down Melissa's defenses and leave her emotionally vulnerable. Now, Isolated and dependent on Eric for support, she was perfectly positioned for the systematic destruction of everything she'd built her identity around. Eric started with her social connections. Using carefully placed rumors and strategic revelations, he ensured that Melissa's affair with Shane became public knowledge throughout their community. Friends who'd supported her during her miraculous survival began treating her with cold disapproval once they learned about her betrayal. Her employer, the marketing firm where she claimed to be working late so often, received an anonymous tip about her falsified timesheets and inappropriate use of company resources. Melissa found herself unemployed within a month of her return, officially due to budget cuts, but everyone understood the real reason. Eric's campaign against Melissa was methodical and relentless. He destroyed her professionally, socially, and financially while maintaining the public facade of a supportive husband standing by his troubled wife. The psychological impact was devastating. Melissa began suffering from severe anxiety and depression, convinced that everyone was watching her, judging her, waiting for her to fail. She wasn't wrong. 3 months after her rescue, Melissa made a discovery that shattered what remained of her sanity. While cleaning out Shane's old office, a task Eric had suggested might provide closure, she found evidence that Eric had known about their affair all along. Hidden in Shane's files were photographs of surveillance equipment that looked suspiciously like the devices Eric used in his private investigation work. There were also copies of financial records that only Eric could have accessed, marked with notations in Eric's distinctive handwriting. When Melissa confronted Eric with the evidence, his response was everything she'd feared and more. "Of course I knew," Eric said calmly, not bothering to maintain his pretense of ignorance. "I've known about your affair for months. I've known about your plans to murder Charlotte. I've known about Shane's embezzlement. I've known everything." Melissa's face went white. You planned the island? The business trip? Shane's death?" "I didn't kill Shane," Eric replied, truthfully. "I simply created circumstances where your true natures could emerge. You killed Shane yourself, Melissa, just like you tried to kill Charlotte." The realization that her husband had orchestrated everything, her capture, her psychological torture, Shane's death, and her systematic destruction since returning home, sent Melissa into a complete psychological breakdown. She was hospitalized again, this time in the psychiatric ward, where she ranted about conspiracies and revenge plots that sounded delusional to medical professionals who didn't know Eric's true capabilities. When Melissa was released 2 weeks later, heavily medicated and barely functional, Eric presented her with divorce papers and a restraining order. She would receive nothing in the settlement. Eric's lawyers had documented enough of her criminal activity to ensure she left the marriage as destitute as she'd entered it. As Melissa packed her few remaining belongings into a battered suitcase, Eric watched from the doorway of their former bedroom. "You could have just divorced me," she said quietly. "You could have turned me into the police. Why did you do all this?" Eric's answer was delivered with the same cold precision he'd used throughout his campaign of revenge. "Because you tried to murder a child for money, and some sins are too great for conventional punishment. You needed to understand what it feels like to lose everything you've ever cared about, to be completely powerless, to face death because of someone else's choices." Melissa left that afternoon, carrying her suitcase to a bus station where she would begin a new life with nothing but the clothes on her back and the medications that kept her functional. Eric never saw her again, but he knew that wherever she went, she would carry the psychological scars of her time on the island and the knowledge that her own choices had destroyed everything she'd once valued. Justice, Eric reflected, was a dish best served with a side of irony. Chapter 8: Consequences. 6 months after Melissa's departure, Eric Maloney had settled into a new routine. His house felt different without her presence, cleaner somehow, as if removing a source of toxicity had purified the very air. Charlotte had returned from Denver, healthy and happy, with no memory of the systematic poisoning that had nearly killed her. Eric never told his sister Rosemary the full truth about what had happened. She knew that Melissa had been having an affair and that the marriage had ended badly, but she didn't need to know about the murder plot against her daughter. Some knowledge was too heavy for a single mother to carry. But Eric's revenge hadn't ended with Melissa's exile. There were still loose ends to tie up, other participants in the conspiracy who hadn't yet faced consequences for their actions. Jorge Ackerman arrived at Eric's house on a Tuesday evening, carrying a briefcase full of documents and digital files. His investigation into Shane's business activities had uncovered a network of accomplices who'd helped facilitate the embezzlement and money laundering operations. Shane wasn't working alone, Jorge explained as they reviewed the evidence in Eric's study. He had inside help from his accounting firm, a money transfer specialist, and at least 3 other business partners who knew exactly what he was doing. Eric studied the photographs and financial records Jorge had compiled. Each of these people had profited from Shane's crimes, and by extension, they contributed to the conspiracy that had nearly cost Charlotte her life. What kind of timeline are we looking at for prosecuting these people? Eric asked. Jorge smiled grimly. Who said anything about prosecution? Over the next several months, Eric methodically dismantled the lives of everyone who'd helped Shane steal money and plan his escape with Melissa. The accountant found himself the subject of an IRS audit that revealed decades of tax fraud. The money transfer specialist discovered that his international banking contacts had mysteriously dried up, leaving his business worthless overnight. Shane's business partners faced a series of escalating problems. Suspicious fires at their warehouses, key employees poached by competitors, major clients canceling contracts after receiving anonymous tips about financial irregularities. Within a year, all 3 men had filed for bankruptcy. Eric's approach to these secondary targets was different from his treatment of Melissa and Shane. He didn't need them to understand they were being punished. He simply needed them to suffer consequences proportional to their crimes. They'd helped steal money, so he ensured they lost money. They planned to escape justice, so he made sure justice found them anyway. The beauty of Eric's campaign was its deniability. Every disaster that befell Shane's accomplices could be explained by coincidence, bad luck, or natural business cycles. No one could prove that Eric Maloney had orchestrated their downfall, even though several of them suspected it. One of Shane's former partners, Max Peck, actually confronted Eric directly at a business conference 8 months after Shane's death. "I know what you're doing," Max said, cornering Eric near the hotel bar. "Shane told me about you before he died. You're systematically destroying everyone who worked with him." Eric's expression remained perfectly neutral. "I'm sorry for your business troubles, Max, but I'm not sure what you think I have to do with your problems. Have you considered that your difficulties might be related to your association with Shane's criminal activities?" Max's face flushed red. "You can't prove anything, and you can't keep this up forever." "Keep what up?" Eric asked innocently. "I'm a private investigator, Max. I investigate things. If people don't want to be investigated, they probably shouldn't commit crimes." That conversation was the last time anyone openly accused Eric of orchestrating their downfall. Word spread through Shane's network that their former associate's widow was best left alone, and that any attempts at retaliation would likely result in even worse consequences. Eric found a certain satisfaction in watching these men learn to fear him. They thought they were clever, stealing money and covering their tracks, never imagining that their crimes would eventually reach someone with Eric's particular set of skills and complete lack of mercy for thieves and traitors. By the end of the year, Eric had effectively erased every trace of Shane's criminal network. The stolen money had been recovered and returned to its rightful owners. The corrupt professionals had lost their licenses and livelihoods, and the business partners who'd enabled the crimes were facing bankruptcy and possible criminal charges. Charlotte celebrated her 8th birthday with a party at Eric's house, surrounded by family and friends who had no idea how close she'd come to never seeing another birthday. As Eric watched her blow out the candles on her cake, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Justice had been served. The guilty had been punished. The innocent had been protected. And Eric Maloney had reminded the world why betraying his trust was the most expensive mistake anyone could make. But there was still one final chapter to be written in this story of revenge and redemption. Chapter 9, The Final Accounting. 2 years had passed since the island incident, and Eric Maloney had built a new life from the ashes of his old one. He'd expanded his private investigation business, focusing on cases involving financial fraud and domestic disputes. His reputation for thoroughness and results had made him one of the most sought-after investigators in the region. Charlotte, now 9 years old, was thriving under Eric's watchful care. Rosemary had remarried a good man named Keith McMahon, giving Charlotte a stable family environment while keeping her close enough for Eric to maintain his protective oversight. Eric had also begun dating again, a relationship with Dr. Leah McDowell, a forensic psychologist who understood his work and didn't ask too many questions about his methods. She knew about his failed marriage and his devotion to Charlotte, but she didn't need to know the full story of how his revenge against Melissa and Shane had unfolded. Life was good. Eric had achieved everything he'd set out to accomplish when he'd first discovered Melissa's betrayal. Justice had been served, his family was safe, and he'd rebuilt his personal and professional life on a foundation that couldn't be shaken by lies or manipulation. But the past has a way of reasserting itself when you least expect it. The phone call came on a Thursday evening in March. Jorge Ackerman's voice was tense when Eric answered. "We have a problem," Jorge said without preamble. "Melissa is back." Eric felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. "Where?" "She's been living in Seattle under a different name, working as a home health aide again." "And Eric, there have been incidents." Jorge's investigation revealed that Melissa had spent the past 2 years rebuilding her life and her confidence. The broken woman who'd left Eric's house with nothing but a suitcase had gradually recovered her sense of purpose and her appetite for causing harm. Under the name Leslie Hawkins, Melissa had found work caring for elderly patients in private homes. Over the past 6 months, 3 of her clients had died unexpectedly, all showing symptoms consistent with slow poisoning. The deaths had been attributed to natural causes, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who knew Melissa's history. "She's killing again," Jorge concluded, "and she's gotten better at it." Eric stared out his office window at the city lights, processing this information. He'd assumed that his psychological warfare on the island and the systematic destruction of Melissa's life afterward would have broken her permanently. Instead, it seemed to have taught her to be more careful, more patient, more methodical in her crimes. "There's more," Jorge continued. "She's been asking questions about you, about Charlotte, about Rosemary's family. She's planning something." Eric's blood turned to ice. Melissa had learned from her mistakes. She wouldn't make another direct attempt on Charlotte's life, but she might target someone else Eric cared about as a way of punishing him for what he'd done to her. "I need everything you have on her current life," Eric said. "Addresses, associates, financial records, everything." "And Jorge? I need it tonight." The next morning, Eric was on a plane to Seattle. He told Leah he had an urgent case that required travel, and he'd asked Keith and Rosemary to be extra vigilant about Charlotte's safety. He didn't explain why, but his tone conveyed the seriousness of the situation. Eric spent 3 days conducting surveillance on Melissa's new life. She lived in a modest apartment under her assumed identity, worked for a legitimate home health agency, and appeared to be a model employee. But Eric's trained eye caught details that others missed. The way she studied obituary notices, the careful attention she paid to patients' family dynamics, the subtle changes in her behavior around medication schedules. She was hunting, and she was getting ready to kill again. Eric's decision was swift and final. He'd given Melissa a chance to disappear and start over after the island. She'd chosen to use that opportunity to continue murdering innocent people. Now she would face the ultimate consequence for her choice. The method Eric chose was elegant in its simplicity. Melissa had been slowly poisoning her current client, an 87-year-old former teacher named Ruth, using the same ipecac-based approach she'd used on Charlotte. Eric simply accelerated the timeline. He broke into Melissa's apartment while she was at work and replaced her carefully measured doses with a much larger quantity of the same poison. When Melissa administered what she thought was her usual non-lethal dose that evening, she actually gave Ruth enough toxin to trigger a massive cardiac event. Ruth survived. Eric had called 911 anonymously, reporting suspicious symptoms that prompted immediate medical intervention. But when doctors tested Ruth's blood, they found enough poison to kill several people. Melissa was arrested within hours. A search of her apartment revealed detailed notes about dosing schedules, research into untraceable toxins, and a journal documenting her plans for Ruth's natural death. Further investigation connected her to the suspicious deaths of her previous clients. But Eric's masterstroke was the evidence he'd planted linking Melissa to her true identity. Police discovered that Leslie Hawkins was actually Melissa Maloney, who'd fled the country after her husband's business partner died in mysterious circumstances. The island incident, which had been treated as a tragic accident, was reopened as a potential murder investigation. Eric watched from the gallery as Melissa was arraigned on multiple counts of attempted murder and conspiracy. She looked older, harder, but when their eyes met across the courtroom, he saw a flash of the woman who'd once tried to kill his niece for money. Melissa was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, noting the particularly heinous nature of her crimes against vulnerable elderly victims, recommended that she serve her sentence in maximum security isolation. As Eric left the courthouse, he felt the same sense of completion he'd experienced after Charlotte's birthday party. This time, justice was truly final. Melissa would never again have the opportunity to hurt innocent people, and she would spend the rest of her life understanding that some choices carry consequences that echo through time. Eric Maloney had learned long ago that the world was full of people who would betray trust, exploit kindness, and harm the innocent for personal gain. His role wasn't to change human nature. It was to ensure that those choices carried appropriate costs. The final chapter of his revenge against Melissa and Shane was now complete, and Eric was ready to focus on building a future where the people he loved could live safely, knowing that he would always be watching, always be ready to protect them from those who would do them harm. Some men forgive their enemies and move on with their lives. Eric Maloney wasn't one of those men. He was something far more dangerous, a man with the skills to identify